Rivalry week in college football is always so beautiful to me because one day that same week you're probably enjoying the company of your family and friends on Thanksgiving, hopefully eating some good food, and 24 to 48 hours later, it's hate week towards whatever school your team is playing that weekend. The weekend of college football after Thanksgiving but before conference championship week is arguably the 2 days that a lot of fans are looking forward to the most. Even if the skill gap is crazy and you know your team is probably going to win and vice versa, rivalry week just means more. And you better hope that no one gets an insane upset against your team during this week in particular, because if they do, you will hear about that loss forever. And today, we're going to talk about some of those. My name is Caleb, and a lot of the college sports landscape before we got such major realignment was built around certain rivalries. They mean so much in so many ways to people that either attended those schools, grew up as fans, had family members go there, or however you became a fan. These places have so much space in the lives of many. We got a handful of games to talk about today, so let's go ahead and jump into some of the biggest rivalry week upsets in college football history. And just a few criteria for this video, I'm only going to be talking about games that traditionally happen in the last week of the regular season, so I won't be including games like the Red River Rivalry, but I will speak on games like the Apple Cup because before Washington left the Pac-12, that was traditionally a rivalry week game until they moved it to earlier in the season. I will also only speak on the biggest power conference rivalries when it comes to football, so some games will still get a mention instead of an in-depth look. And finally, we will include games from the most recent version of the Pac-12 and the Big 12 from some time ago, since there was a ton of realignment between those two conferences specifically, and a lot of these matchups aren't played yearly anymore. So with that, we'll start with the Big 12, and there's a few rivalries that I want to talk about with this conference historically. Because the Big 12 lost so many teams to other conferences, a lot of their rivalries don't play yearly anymore. For example, we'll start with the Colorado-Nebraska rivalry that played yearly at the end of the season since the 1890s and from the 1990s until 2010 during rivalry week before Nebraska would leave for the Big 10 and Colorado for the Pac-12 respectively. And arguably the biggest upset in the entire series came in 2001 when number 15 Colorado blew out number 2 and national title contender Nebraska in Boulder with a final score of 62-36. That Nebraska team was being led by Heisman winner Eric Crouch and the 20 plus other players that would at least play 1 year in the NFL. This game saw the Huskers go down an insane 28-3, and there's not many college football teams that are going to make a comeback like that in a dire game. Colorado knocked them out of the opportunity to play in the Big 12 championship that year, and they'd go on to beat Texas and win the conference championship, their last one as of the making of this video. Nebraska was a win in away from the national championship game that year, but because of the old BCS system and their otherwise really good resume, they got to play for the Natty anyway, but they did lose to Miami. On that same weekend in 2001, the Bedlam series between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State provided a much lower scoring but equally disheartening matchup between two in-state rivals. The defending national champion Sooners were the 4th ranked team in the country headed into rivalry week, and with the loss from Nebraska, could jump into national title hopes once again. And they were playing unranked Oklahoma State, who were 3-7, playing in their first year under Les Miles. But the Pokes this week showcased that anything can happen during the most anticipated weekend of the season. The game was a slow defensive chess match where Oklahoma State's defense put on a generational performance against a contender that saw them end the game with zero rushing yards. A quote I found from OU head coach Bob Stoops after the game said they simply got outplayed. The Bedlam series is also a game where these two don't play each other anymore, with Oklahoma being in the SEC now, and for a while, it was also like that with the Lone Star Showdown between Texas and Texas A&M. Both once members of the Big 12 and both reunited in the SEC, this was a rivalry week staple until 2011 when the Aggies moved conferences. This game was only played twice in the 2010s, returned in 2024, and will be played again for the foreseeable future. But in terms of the biggest upset ever, there is a few to choose from, but I want to go with 2006. Defending national champion Texas came into the game ranked 11th and had just lost a close matchup to Kansas State the week before for their first loss of the season. Vince Young wasn't in Austin anymore, but redshirt freshman Colt McCoy was definitely a serviceable starter in his first year. With A&M coming to town that week, they were solid but definitely a huge underdog to a team in the conversation for at least a BCS bowl. The Aggies started the game with a touchdown, and even though the Longhorns had multiple opportunities to get the offense rolling, they just couldn't get anything. They did have a TD called back on an objectively questionable call before halftime, but they'd go scoreless until a Jamal Charles touchdown midway through the third. The score was 7-6 Longhorns headed into the fourth, and that's when A&M went on a 9-minute touchdown drive that put them up 5 after they couldn't score the 2-point conversion. A turnover and a Michael Bennett hit on Colt McCoy later, Texas would fall to their in-state rivals by 5, and with 2 straight losses, a Big 12 title, and a BCS appearance were out of the question. A&M's 244 rushing yards carried them that day, and is a win I'm sure that Aggie fans are still very fond of. That'll wrap up our Big 12 section, and I know there's a few more that we could talk about. Those 3 especially felt like some of the biggest upsets in rivalry week ever, especially in the old Big 12. Honorable mention goes to the 2007 border war between Kansas and Missouri, another game that doesn't get played anymore with Mizzou being in the SEC, but we'll probably never see another year again where both of these teams specifically are national title contenders in the same season and match up in a border war also. Let's move out west and talk about our old beloved Pac-12. And I'm sure so many others miss what we knew as the Pac-12, as they had some of the greatest in-state rivalries in all of college football. It's a shame that some of these have been broken up due to some not being in the same conference anymore, with one in particular being the Apple Cup between Washington and Washington State. The Apple Cup got moved to the last week of the regular season all throughout the 2010s and the early 2020s, and it was mostly dominated by the Huskies as they went 10-2 against Wazoo from 2011 to 2023 before their move to the Big Ten. Even in the larger 100-plus year rivalry, Washington has held the upper hand in the series as a whole, but there have been years where the Cougs have gotten the upper hand and pulled off an insane upset. For our biggest upset in Apple Cup history, we gotta go all the way back to 1982, where the Cougars made a miracle happen in Pullman. The Huskies had been ranked as high as the #1 team in the country that season, had 2 Rose Bowl appearances in a row, and had a 9-game Apple Cup winning streak. Wazoo was coming into the game with only 2 wins on the season, and with the #5 team in the country coming into Pullman, their down season was going to end with another loss to the Huskies. And for most of the game, everything was going according to script. They were down 17-7, but erased the deficit to go up 21-20 in the final minutes of the game. The Huskies would make a drive down to the Cougs 33 to set up for a go-ahead field goal, but All-American kicker Chuck Nelson would miss, and Washington State would pull away for a 24-20 win. To this day, it's still considered the biggest upset in Apple Cup history in a game that went down as a series classic. In another rivalry that saw one school leave for the Big Ten and the other hold it down for the Pac-12, Oregon and Oregon State have had the Civil War game almost every year since 1894. Also no longer a Thanksgiving weekend matchup due to conference realignment, there are a few options that could qualify for the biggest upset ever. But one of the strongest in contention, in my opinion, is one of the more recent matchups from 2022. Thanksgiving weekend in Corvallis, the 9th-ranked Ducks were taking on the 21st-ranked Beavers. Both were still not mathematically eliminated from the Pac-12 championship game, but Oregon, in an offense that featured Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, and a sophomore Bucky Irving, they were easily favored. But the Beavs were no pushover that year, as this was arguably their best team in decades. They did look outmatched to start the game though, as the Ducks got out to a 31-10 lead midway through the third. But a Deshaun Fenwick TD late in the third quarter inspired a Civil War comeback for the ages. The Beavs outscored Oregon 21-3 in the fourth and capped off the upset with a defensive stop late in the fourth to bring the Platypus Trophy back to Corvallis. This game would be the second to last Civil War between the two schools before they go their separate ways conference-wise, but it was this game in particular that showed the true spirit of this series during those rare times when both the Ducks and Beavers field great rosters. And before we move on from the Pac-12, we have to talk about the Pac-12 rivalry between USC and UCLA. One of the few rivalries preserved due to them both being in the Big Ten now, these two programs are West Coast football personified, especially during the 60s and 70s when both teams were consistently in the top 10. Sure, it's been mostly the Trojans who have had most of the success on the field, but UCLA has had its moments of being a dominant program. One of those years was not 2006, but they somehow upset the #2 team in the country and a team just coming off a national championship appearance. With a win in 2006, USC was going back to the Natty, and all they had to do was take care of business in Pasadena against the Bruins. SC's offense came in averaging 32 points a game, but only got held to 9 points. UCLA's defense put on a historic performance slowing down this offense, not allowing a single touchdown, and got key stops late in the game when they needed it. It ended a 7-year losing streak when UCLA knocked USC out of national championship contention. It may be the greatest upset for the victory belt ever, and there's not a ton of argument against it. Quick honorable mention before we move on, the duel in the desert game between Arizona and Arizona State has also been preserved due to them both being in the Big 12 now, and like with every other rivalry, there have been huge upsets from time to time, but none bigger than 1982, which saw unranked Arizona deny the 6th-ranked 9-1 Sun Devils a trip to the Rose Bowl, something they never ended up being able to do during their time in the conference. Now as we get into the current day established conferences, we'll start with the ACC. We all know the ACC is typically thought of as a basketball conference because when you think of rivalries there, they're taking place at Cameron Indoor, Dean Dome, or even more recently at the KFC Yum Center. But on the field, the best ACC rivalries historically have seen one team from this conference playing someone from another conference, with the biggest ones being the SEC. And one of those in particular being the clean, old-fashioned hate rivalry between Georgia Tech and Georgia. We have seen some absolutely classic games in this series, especially in 2024's 8-overtime thriller in Athens, where Tech almost pulled off one of the biggest upsets of the season. This is another one of those rivalries that goes all the way back to the 1800s and is one of the few interconference games that have been protected throughout the years. But unlike the other games we've talked about, the biggest upset in the series arguably comes almost 100 years ago. The 1927 game between UGA and Tech is surprisingly one of the most documented games in the series, and while there is no footage and very few images, it is regarded as both the first classic and upset in the series. Georgia, of the SoCon at the time, was number 1 in the country and undefeated headed into rivalry week, while Georgia Tech, also of the SoCon and then known as the Golden Tornado, also fielded a pretty great team. The Bulldogs were the best team in the country in a win away from the Rose Bowl and did nothing to take advantage of it. Tech shut out Georgia 12-0 on a cold and muddy early December game. But in terms of modern games, you gotta go with 2008 when Tech upset Georgia in Athens in a high-scoring shootout that saw the Yellow Jackets put up a 33-point second half against Matthew Stafford, Noshawn Moreno, and the Bulldogs. But for our other ACC-SEC rivalry, we don't have to go back nearly as far, just a bit over 30 years. And it's technically not even an upset, but let me explain. This is one of the more obvious rivalries in college football, but the fact that both of these historic programs have had plenty of games where they were both good at the same time has given us tons of great matchups in this series, which leads me to Rivalry Week 1994, a game that would later be referred to as the Choke at Doak. Number 4 Florida coached by Steve Spurrier, number 7 Florida State coached by Bobby Bowden, both 9-1 in a top 10 matchup in Tallahassee. Florida was favored, but the game was projected to be close until it wasn't. Florida got out to a 31-3 lead headed into the fourth quarter, and it was all but wrapped up until the defending national champion Noles put on a comeback that you'd have to see to believe. Florida State scored 28 points in the fourth quarter, while their defense held the Gators to 44 total yards of offense and no points. The game was tied at 31 after one of the craziest fourth quarter comebacks of all time, and that was it. There was no overtime in the FBS at the time, and the game ended in a 31-31 knot. FSU ran out of time on their last drive to win the game, but secured as much of a moral victory as there is in college football. It's not the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, but an in-state rivalry is always going to have weight in college sports, and the Choke at Doak in particular is one of the more interesting kinda upsets of all time. The other ACC rivalries like UNC, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and even Clemson, South Carolina are also keeping the tradition of in-state rivalries alive. While there haven't been any crazy upsets that had like a national title or anything on the line, believe me when I say they get active during these games too. Shout out to ACC. We only have a few more games to go through, but as we transition over to the SEC, as someone who grew up in the Midwest and Big Ten territory, some of these games during Rivalry Week were required viewing even for all of us up here. Some of the most iconic games in the sport come from this conference during this weekend specifically, and that is no exaggeration. When we're looking at Ole Miss and Mississippi State, the Egg Bowl has maybe given us some of the funniest moments of any of the major Rivalry Week games, from Elijah Moore or the Brawl from 1997, but the game we're talking about today happened in between those, so let's go to 2014. Mississippi State is ranked 4th in the country at 10-1 and in position to make the first ever college football playoff, maybe the most unlikely SEC team going into that season who were in that position. Ole Miss was ranked 19th and also had a great year to that point, but were underdogs in the Egg Bowl. This is one of the closer rivalries in college football all time, and this was another year where it could realistically go either way. It wasn't a huge line by any means, but the Bulldogs were favored to come out on top. And fun fact about this game, this was the first ever Egg Bowl that was nationally televised over the Iron Bowl on CBS, as the network chose this game over contractual reasons. But they did make the right choice, as they'd get to see CFP implications firsthand. Ole Miss running back Jalen Watson put the Revs on his back and rushed for 141 yards on their way to an all-time Egg Bowl upset 31-17. Unfortunately for Ole Miss fans, this win would be vacated later on, but they still got to deny one of their greatest rivals a chance at a national championship. And in the case of the Iron Bowl, denying each other a chance at college football immortality at the end of the year is only one part of what some call the most storied rivalry in college football. So many moments in this series come to mind as a fan, and I'm only in my 20s. Jalen Milroe to Isaiah Bond game-winning touchdown a few years ago, Kick 6 becoming one of the greatest plays in sports history, and so many more insane moments come to mind. While there have been so many great Iron Bowl moments in my lifetime, the 1972 Punt Bama Punt game may take it for the most insane upset in Iron Bowl history. Up until the late 90s, the Iron Bowl took place at a neutral site in Birmingham, Alabama at Legion Field. Bear Bryant had the Tide ranked second in the country and undefeated at 10-0, while Auburn was a top 10 team also, ranked 9th at 9-1. Alabama had a controlling but low-scoring 16-3 lead with just about 10 minutes left in the game. A few more defensive stops and bragging rights were headed back to Tuscaloosa for another year. After Auburn's only field goal of the game, Bama got the ball back and had an offensive drive stall and were ready to punt. But instead, it was blocked by Bill Newton of Auburn and returned for a touchdown by David Langer. The score is now 16-10. On the very next Alabama possession, they'd get their punt blocked again by Bill Newton and returned by David Langer, and the extra point gave Auburn a 17-16 lead in the most improbable way you'll ever see. Alabama quarterback Terry Davis would get picked off on their final possession to seal the Tigers' win, one of the craziest upsets in Iron Bowl and SEC history in general. Alabama would retaliate by winning the next 9 Iron Bowls after that, but I think everyone has to watch those last few minutes of the Punt Bama Punt game at least once. The SEC does have some other interconference rivalries during their hate week, like Clemson, South Carolina, Kentucky, Louisville, and some of the others we've mentioned already. Couldn't go on without at least giving them a shout out. The Big Ten, the conference I grew up watching, and the games I looked forward to most as a kid. The old Oak Bucket game, the classic rivalry between IU and Purdue that I prefer on the basketball court, and the tide has turned in the direction of Bloomington in recent years and for the foreseeable future. The Land of Lincoln game between Illinois and Northwestern may be put on the back burner in a lot of years, but it's one of the more balanced rivalries in all of college football. And Minnesota and Wisconsin fighting for the Paul Bunyan Trophy every year is very underrated too, especially when we're fortunate enough to see a snow game in either of the 2 coldest places in the conference in a series that's literally tied as of 2024. Aside from the 1967 Indiana team that beat number 2 Purdue to get to the Rose Bowl, the very insane upsets in these series are kind of slim, despite tons of great games individually. But we gotta talk about the game. The game between Michigan and Ohio State is the pinnacle of the sport, and maybe the most important game that's not the national championship if you're asking anyone in Ann Arbor or Columbus. I mean, we're talking about refusal to say the other school's name. That's real hatred between these 2 institutions' football programs. There are a handful of upsets that we can talk about in this series, especially from more recent years. 2024 is always the one that comes to mind, where unranked Michigan went into Columbus to beat eventual national champion Ohio State, and of course the flag plant and fight after the game only made this game more memorable. But what if I told you that there was an upset during a game back in the late 60s that kicked off the greatest decade in the series and would later be dubbed the 10-Year War? Number 1 Ohio State and number 12 Michigan met at the Big House in Ann Arbor the week of Thanksgiving. Ohio State was undefeated, the defending national champions, and on a 22-game win streak. Michigan, in what was thought to be a rebuilding year, had overachieved and entered the game 7-2 and ranked 12th under first-year head coach Bo Schembechler. It was going to be a very tall task going into a new era against Woody Hayes and his Buckeyes. With a record crowd in Michigan Stadium, the 1969 Ohio State-Michigan game may be the definitive game and upset of the entire series. The first half saw the 2 Big Ten powerhouses exchange touchdowns through the first 2 quarters, and the Wolverines held a 24-12 lead at halftime. The second half saw the pendulum swing in the opposite direction, and the 2 defenses started to put in work, but the offenses were definitely prone to mistakes. Missed field goals by both teams in the third quarter, including multiple long drives that stalled, saw a frustrated Woody Hayes emphasize aggressiveness to the Buckeyes in the fourth quarter. Despite Michigan's defense one-upping the Ohio State offense each chance they could, OSU stayed in the game, but 3 fourth-quarter picks from their offense did them in, and it was over. The Buckeyes' 7 turnovers led to their demise, and the Wolverines got only their 3rd win against Ohio State during the 1960s. Called the upset of the century by ABC play-by-play man Bill Fleming, this game started the 10-year war between Ohio State and Michigan, where during the 1970s, they'd match up 4 times as top 5 opponents in the same year and shared the Big Ten title 6 times during the decade also. Michigan ended the 10 games of Hayes versus Schembechler with a record of 5-4-1 in what may be the single greatest decade between 2 teams in the history of college football. So we say all that to say, me calling these the biggest upsets during rivalry week for every team we talked about today is fully subjective because different games mean so many different things to the fans of these teams. There are some games we may have briefly mentioned today that people may prefer as the biggest upsets ever, or games that we didn't even mention at all. And we didn't even get through every single rivalry, which shows how extensive this topic can be. I don't think anyone can agree on one definitive game being the biggest upset for a particular team, but one thing everyone here, including our biggest rivals, can agree on: hate week, rivalry week, or whatever you want to call it, is one of the best ways to end the college football regular season. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.